Das ist ein nicht melanozytärer Hautkrebs. Er kommt relativ häufig vor. Ich war wirklich überrascht, als sie sagte, dass er als Melanom zurückgekehrt sei.
For more than a decade, Norah O'Donnell has been one of the most recognizable faces in American television news. As anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News, she sat behind the desk that once belonged to legends like Walter Cronkite and Dan Rather, delivering the day's biggest stories with the composure viewers had come to expect from her. But behind that calm, authoritative presence was a health scare that quietly reshaped how she saw her own life, and, years later, a career decision that would change what viewers saw on their screens every evening. This is the story of Norah O'Donnell's melanoma diagnosis, her recovery, and the choices that eventually led her away from the anchor desk she had called home for 5 years. Skin checks are the kind of appointment that's easy to put off. You feel fine, nothing hurts, there's always something more urgent on the calendar. For Norah O'Donnell, that was exactly the trap she fell into. She had gone to her dermatologist, Dr. Elizabeth Hale of New Langone Medical Center, for a skin check a couple of years earlier, and everything had come back clear. Life got busy after that, a demanding job, 3 young children, the constant churn of a news anchor's schedule, and the yearly follow-up she was supposed to schedule kept slipping. It was only as the year drew to a close, right around Thanksgiving, that O'Donnell finally got back into the dermatologist's chair. She has since said publicly that she recognizes how common that lapse is, especially for women juggling careers and families, and that it's part of why she felt it was important to eventually share what happened next during that checkup. Dr. Hale noticed something on O'Donnell's upper back that didn't look right. It wasn't dramatic or obviously alarming to the untrained eye, just a mole that appeared slightly asymmetric, with borders that weren't quite even and coloring that seemed to vary across its surface. To a dermatologist trained to spot the early warning signs of skin cancer, though, those 3 details were exactly the kind of red flags worth investigating further. Dr. Hale decided to biopsy the spot, along with a second mole nearby, and sent the samples off for testing. Then, O'Donnell went back to her life, assuming, as most people do, that the results would come back clean. It didn't take long for the answer to arrive. O'Donnell has described being out shopping during the Black Friday rush in the thick of holiday errands when her phone rang with a call from Dr. Hale's office. The biopsy results were in, and they weren't what she was expecting. To her, the diagnosis was melanoma, specifically melanoma in situ, meaning the cancer was still confined to the outermost layer of skin and had not yet spread into deeper tissue where it could reach the bloodstream or lymphatic system. Melanoma is widely recognized as the most dangerous form of skin cancer. Even though it accounts for a small fraction of all skin cancer diagnoses, it is responsible for the overwhelming majority of skin cancer-related deaths because of how aggressively it can spread once it moves beyond the surface. Hearing that word melanoma attached to her own body was enough to stop O'Donnell in her tracks. Even standing in the middle of a crowded store, she has since written about that moment in vivid detail for Good Housekeeping magazine, describing how she pushed through the Black Friday crowds toward the exit, her thoughts spinning and her chest tightening as tears began running down her face. In her own words, she felt trapped in that instant, overwhelmed by a diagnosis she never expected to hear about herself. What followed was something a lot of cancer patients describe, an almost reflexive urge to look inward for blame. O'Donnell has said she found herself questioning how this could have happened to someone who took care of her health, wondering whether she had somehow brought it on herself, and regretting that she had let so much time pass since her last skin check. To put O'Donnell's diagnosis in context, it helps to understand just how serious melanoma is compared with other forms of skin cancer. The American Cancer Society has estimated that tens of thousands of Americans are diagnosed with melanoma every year, and thousands die from it annually. Unlike basal cell or squamous cell carcinoma, the more common, generally less dangerous types of skin cancer that many families, including O'Donnell's own, have dealt with, melanoma develops from the pigment-producing cells in the skin and has a much greater capacity to spread into the bloodstream and lymphatic system if it isn't caught early. That's exactly why the in situ designation attached to O'Donnell's diagnosis mattered so much. It meant the cancer cells were still confined to the outermost layer of skin, the epidermis, and hadn't yet broken through to the dermis below, where blood vessels and lymph channels could carry cancerous cells elsewhere in the body. Doctors often describe melanoma in situ as the earliest, most treatable stage the disease can be caught at essentially stage 0, which is part of why O'Donnell's surgery, while still a real procedure with real recovery time, didn't require the more aggressive treatments like chemotherapy or radiation that later stage melanoma often demands in later interviews. O'Donnell went further into that emotional reckoning. Speaking with InStyle, she admitted to feeling a degree of shame once the shock wore off, telling the outlet she wondered if she had done this to herself. She pointed to a habit that a lot of people her age can relate to: indoor tanning as a teenager and young adult, chasing a golden look before big events like prom. Without any real appreciation for the risk involved, that admission lines up with what medical research has consistently shown about tanning beds. According to data cited by dermatology and cancer research organizations, using an indoor tanning bed even once measurably raises a person's risk of developing melanoma, and the increase in risk is especially steep for people who start young. Combine that with the other risk factors. O'Donnell has openly discussed a family history of skin cancer, fair skin, and a genetic tendency to develop moles, and it becomes easier to understand why a diagnosis that can strike anyone hit her in particular. O'Donnell has been careful in her public comments not to frame this as some kind of moral failing. She has instead used her own experience as a teaching moment, pointing out that plenty of people made the same choices she did simply because the risks weren't well understood or well publicized at the time. Her message, repeated across nearly every interview she's given since, is less about guilt and more about awareness. Get checked regularly, and don't wait until something feels obviously wrong. Beyond the medical side of things, O'Donnell has spoken about how the diagnosis affected her role as a parent. She and her husband, restaurateur Jeffrey Tracy, have 3 children: Grace, Henry, and Raleigh, and O'Donnell chose to sit them down and explain what was happening, rather than keep it from them. She has since reflected that the diagnosis marked the first time she truly confronted her own mortality, and, in a sense, the first time her children did too. That's a heavy realization for any parent to sit with, let alone one who has to deliver the news calmly enough that 3 young kids don't spiral into fear. O'Donnell has said that finding the strength to project calm for her family, even while she herself felt vulnerable, was one of the harder parts of the entire experience. Because the melanoma was caught at such an early stage, Dr. Hale was able to reassure O'Donnell that the cancer was treatable and, critically, curable with a relatively straightforward surgical procedure rather than the more invasive treatments melanoma can require once it spreads. Early in the new year, O'Donnell underwent surgery to remove the affected tissue from her upper back. The procedure left a visible scar, something O'Donnell has spoken about candidly rather than trying to hide. During her recovery, she has described her children helping apply healing ointment to the site as it mended a small, human detail that turned a scary medical experience into something the whole family navigated together. She said that watching her kids take part in her recovery, however small their role was, changed how seriously they took her advice to wear sunscreen and be mindful of sun exposure going forward. In the years since, O'Donnell has remained diligent about follow-up care, returning to Dr. Hale for skin checks every few months rather than waiting the standard year between visits. She has acknowledged in interviews that this routine sometimes turns up spots that need to be biopsied just to be safe, even when they ultimately prove to be nothing serious. Rather than treating that as a burden, she has framed it as the price of vigilance, a small inconvenience compared to catching something dangerous early. What sets O'Donnell's story apart from a private medical scare is how openly and repeatedly she chose to share it. Rather than treating her diagnosis as something to quietly move past, she wrote about the experience for Good Housekeeping, discussed it on CBS This Morning alongside Dr. Hale, and returned to the subject in interviews with outlets including Healthline, InStyle, and Knee's Medline Plus magazine years later. Across those conversations, a consistent message emerges. O'Donnell has emphasized that early detection is what separates a manageable medical episode from a life-threatening one. and that annual skin checks, or more frequent ones, for people with elevated risk factors are one of the simplest things a person can do to protect themselves. She has also used her platform to highlight statistics about melanoma's disproportionate impact, noting that while it makes up a small percentage of skin cancer diagnoses overall, it accounts for the vast majority of skin cancer deaths precisely because it can be so easy to miss until it's already spread. In one of her more personal reflections, published through NE's Medline Plus magazine, O'Donnell described her diagnosis as reshaping her understanding of her own vulnerability and said that even hearing the words describing her condition was something she never expected to face. That kind of candor from someone whose job is usually to report on other people's stories has resonated with viewers, many of whom have said her openness pushed them to book a skin check of their own. It's worth noting that O'Donnell's decision to go public wasn't a one-time press release or a single interview she gave and then moved on from. She has returned to the topic repeatedly over the years, at different stages of her recovery and in different media formats, from print magazines to daytime talk shows to health-focused digital publications. That pattern suggests a deliberate choice to keep the conversation going rather than let it fade after an initial news cycle. Dermatologists and cancer researchers have often pointed out that public figures sharing personal health stories can meaningfully move the needle on screening rates, simply because it gives people permission to take a symptom or a nagging appointment seriously instead of putting it off. O'Donnell herself has echoed that idea, saying she hoped her story would nudge even one person who had been putting off a skin check to finally go. She has also used her television platform in a more structural way, bringing her own dermatologist, Dr. Hale, onto CBS This Morning to walk viewers through exactly what a suspicious mole can look like, the asymmetry, the uneven borders, the shifting color, so that the warning signs wouldn't feel abstract to people watching at home. That kind of on-air explainer, delivered by the doctor who diagnosed her rather than a generic expert, gave the segment a level of authenticity that a standard public service announcement wouldn't have carried. To understand why O'Donnell's eventual departure from the CBS Evening News anchor chair mattered so much to viewers, it helps to look at the path that got her there. Norah O'Donnell was born in January 1974 and spent part of her childhood in San Antonio, Texas, before her family's work took them briefly to South Korea and then back to Texas. She attended Douglas MacArthur High School before enrolling at Georgetown University, where she earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy and later a master's degree in liberal studies. Her journalism career began modestly as a staff writer covering Congress for the publication Roll Call. From there, she spent roughly 12 years building her reputation at NBC, working across a range of roles that included Today Show commentator, chief Washington correspondent for MSNBC, and White House correspondent for NBC News. She also anchored Weekend Today and contributed reporting to NBC Nightly News, steadily building the credentials that would eventually make her one of the most trusted political and White House reporters in the country. In 2011, O'Donnell moved to CBS, joining as a co-anchor of CBS This Morning. Her rise continued from there. And in May 2019, she was named anchor and managing editor of the CBS Evening News, one of the most prestigious and historically significant roles in American broadcast journalism, previously held by some of the most respected names in the industry. Along the way, she also became a contributing correspondent for 60 Minutes and took on responsibilities covering major political events for the network. Taking over the CBS Evening News wasn't just another job title, it placed O'Donnell in a lineage that stretches back to some of the most influential figures in the history of American television. The broadcast has, at various points, been anchored by journalists whose names became synonymous with trusted news delivery for entire generations of American households. Stepping into that chair meant O'Donnell was now the person millions of viewers turned to at the end of the day for a steady, credible read on what had happened in the world, a responsibility she has said she took seriously, particularly during a stretch of her tenure that included a global pandemic and one of the most contentious presidential election cycles in recent memory. During her run as anchor, O'Donnell also made a notable decision to relocate the broadcast's home base to Washington, D.C., a shift that let her lean more heavily into political coverage, given her decades of experience reporting from the nation's capital. That arrangement lasted for the final years of her tenure, before the broadcast eventually returned to a New York-based format after her departure. O'Donnell's tenure produced several interviews that stood out even in a career full of high-profile moments. She traveled to Saudi Arabia to interview Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, marking the first time in over a decade that a U.S. television network had secured an interview with a Saudi leader. During that conversation, she pressed him on sensitive topics, including the war in Yemen, tensions with Iran, and human rights concerns, the kind of pointed questioning that reinforced